When economists or policymakers measure growth or even quality of life and well-being, one of the most common indicators they use is GDP, or gross domestic product. And this is a measure of economic growth and productive value. And while our economic success is important to our growth as a province and a country, sometimes GDP doesn't give us the full story on our progress as a society. Hey there, you're listening to the Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host, Scott Crockett, and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. On this episode, we're talking to ATB's Holly Regel, the Director of Social Impact Partnerships, and Afiba Nyamekye, the Director of Data and Innovation, about ATB's Social Progress Index. Derived from the Global Social Progress Imperative, Holly and Afiba have been working to measure Alberta's social well-being and progress beyond GDP as part of the organization's overall greater good strategy. ATB is the first company in Canada to partner with the Global Imperative to create a provincial index, and the organization has been working hard to put the index into action. And we are talking to Holly and Afiba to explore the province's strengths and vulnerabilities, look at where we rank, and also look into how we can continue to advance broad social progress and build shared prosperity. And if you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a quick review and a rating. For now, enjoy the show. Well, Holly, Afiba, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about social progress beyond the measurement of GDP. Before we get into our conversation today, can you each please just share with our listeners a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and why you do it? Maybe Afiba, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Brittany. Happy to be here to share this work. So thanks for the opportunity. I'm Afiba Nyamekye, and I work quite closely with Holly. We're part of the ESG strategy team at ATB Financial, and I'm an economist and data scientist. So my role is largely focused on data analytics, kind of tracking and measuring progress of our various strategies. And also bringing more data-driven lens to how we're making our social impact, whether that's economic impacts or social impacts through some of our partnerships in the community. So that's a little bit about my role.
And I'm a director in our social innovation team. I lead the partnerships side from a social impact perspective and how we partner in the community. Our team also is part of the ESG lens within ATB, so part of that broader scope.
Thank you so much.
ESG. A common topic for us on this podcast.
So we're here to talk about the Social Progress Index, which is created by the Social Progress Imperative. And this is a tool that ATB has been using or working to kind of adapt to measure Alberta's social well-being and progress beyond just gross domestic product or GDP. And we're going to get into the details of that a little bit later, but let's just set the scene a little bit. So social progress, that's a very large, vague term. Can you tell us what social progress is? Maybe provide some examples of that?
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is quite nebulous to define what social progress is, and it might mean different things to different audiences. But how the social progress imperative defines it, I think, is really a good way to go about it. And that's looking at the capacity of any society to really meet the basic needs of its people, of its community. So basic needs, and also providing whether that's well-being, whether that's basic nutrition, and also opportunity for people to thrive. So beyond our basic needs as humans, we also want to thrive. We want opportunities. We want access to advanced education, we want personal rights and freedoms, so a plethora of different opportunities to ensure that any society is really thriving.
And I think the natural follow-on question from that is, why is this an imperative? Why is measuring GDP not enough to understand how a society is progressing?
Yeah, well, I'm an economist, so I would always argue that there's a role for GDP or the various metrics or measures of GDP in our society, but it goes back to how GDP was conceived and the reasons for it, right? So GDP was really created in the aftermath of the Second World War to measure economic performance, economic growth. It was never intended to really assess well-being or social progress. Now, understandably, after the war, the concern was, well, how do we rebuild economies? So the focus from the onset was economic growth and economic performance. It wasn't intended to measure well-being or social progress. And as a result, GDP doesn't fully capture a number of dimensions. For example, it doesn't capture environmental pollution. I have a kiddo, a toddler who goes to daycare. If I stay at home and take care of said kiddo, that's not going to be captured in GDP. But while he goes to daycare, there is a dollar value attached, and that's reflected in GDP. So GDP has never really been a fulsome metric, if you will. It has its place, but I think that the reason that the Social Progress Index, it's really an imperative, or the Social Progress Imperative came up with the idea, is to address that shortcoming, that GDP was a great metric for the 20th century. Now, as we grapple with the pandemic and other challenges of our times, we need to evolve the metrics accordingly.
Well, Afiba, the economists on our team will certainly be cheering your defense of GDP and economic growth there as an important component. We totally agree. They do actually capture a lot, and there's a lot of good things in society that are delivered just through economic growth itself. But, I liked how you put that obviously it doesn't capture everything. And, one of the oldest maxims in business, but it's, proven true in my experience over and over is, what gets measured gets delivered. So I think that's some of what we're talking about here. So let's talk about that then. Let's move on to the Social Progress Index being a tool that measures not only economic progress through things like GDP, but also highlights social progress and social needs as well. So sort of a two-part question. How did this tool come about and what does it include?
Great question. The Social Progress Index was the brainchild of a number of economists. Maybe it might surprise some people, but I would say it's not surprising, and statisticians. So Michael Porter of Fame and Five Forces fame is actually the chair of the board. And then Mike Green, who's a fairly renowned economist, is currently the CEO. And it came about because of the recognition that there are a number of indices that measure well-being or satisfaction and happiness indices and what have you, but none that really do so in a rigorous way, and especially none that really focus solely on social and environmental indicators. So quite often what they'll do is they'll look at a number of economic indicators in conjunction with social or environmental indicators. So where the gap that the SPI really fills is looking at just the social and environmental indicators so that we can disentangle those kind of confounding effects from economic and social and environmental to really see what's driving what. And so when you think about GDP as an example, Costa Rica actually has a much lower GDP per capita than the US, but Costa Rica outperforms the US when it comes to social progress. Right. So the goal was, how do we ensure that we have a consistent metric to really assess social progress across the globe in a rigorous and more systematic fashion than what we had before?
Absolutely. Well, we all love data here. So let's get a little bit into the data. Let's start with Canada and then we'll get to Alberta afterwards. Yeah, I'd say the headline for Canada is we rank 6th out of 168 countries that are measured. Speaking as a Canadian, it just at the headline gives me a little bit of pride. I think that puts us in the upper region. But walk us through that ranking. Where do you feel like Canada performs well and where do we have room where we need to improve?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is worth celebrating. You look at where Canada is, it consistently ranks amongst the top performers. So usually the top performers being Norway, the other Scandinavian countries, Japan, New Zealand, there's always a top performers plus Canada. So it's something to celebrate. But yes, to your point, where we perform really well across the country is when it comes to things like the basic needs, the basic human needs dimension. So the SPI is structured around 3 core dimensions. So basic human needs, foundations of well-being, that includes things like access to healthcare, and then opportunity. And opportunity would encompass access to advanced education, access to information and communications, right? Those areas that people also need to thrive. And Canada does quite well along those dimensions, especially basic human needs. In some regards, ICT, information and communications technology, access to advanced education, however, is an area of opportunity, right? So where there are some opportunities and areas for improvement for Canada as a whole is when you look at things like inclusiveness. So the inclusiveness component, and this might surprise some people when you think about how Canada typically performs globally when it comes to inclusiveness, right? But for Canada itself, when you look at where it performs really well and where there's room for improvement, the inclusiveness component has the lowest score. So there are 12 components in the SPI, and the inclusiveness component is actually the lowest score, which kind of forces you to take a step back and say, well, why, right? So the inclusiveness component includes things like acceptance of gays and lesbians. It includes things like violence and discrimination against minorities. And when we compare the inclusiveness score for Canada against, comparators like the US, it's definitely higher than the US and other OECD countries. But for Canada, given its reputation, I think it just highlights that there's room for improvement. And we can see that in the last couple of years, and this is not unique to Canada by any means, a lot of societies have seen challenges. They've seen more inequities, they've seen violence against various sexual or gender diverse minorities. So I think that's what driving some of those trends. But overall, there is a lot to celebrate for Canada when it comes to the SPI for sure.
Important to identify, though, where we need to improve. And yeah, it surprises me as a Canadian because I like to think of us as a very inclusive society. I think you stated that well, that we're better than some, but that's an area where we still got lots of room where we must improve.
Yeah, and the other thing I would add is that, sometimes when we look at the overall or the average, it can certainly mask nuances and differences, right? So I mentioned that Canada performs well on basic human needs. Now, basic human needs also encompasses access to water and sanitation. And it is well documented that for Indigenous people in particular, that access to water and sanitation across certain communities is a huge issue because of systemic inequities and some of the impacts of colonialism. So just to be mindful that as we look at even areas where we're performing well, that try to be cognizant that there are nuances.
That experience isn't universal. Absolutely. I think that's very important.
Let's take this a little bit closer to home. Let's talk about Alberta. Now, ATB has adapted this tool to measure Alberta, but ATB is also a bank. It's a financial institution. So before I want to get into the data around Alberta, can you talk a little bit about why a bank is getting involved in this work?
Yeah, we actually get asked that question quite a bit, and we would reply with, why not a bank or financial institution? Why not ATB? We like to innovate, and Alberta in particular is a very innovative province, right? So there's a method to our madness and an actual reason, but we like to start with why not, right? If we're really trying to make a difference in Alberta. It does stem from around 2 years ago, we went with a commitment through what we call our greater good strategy, which is now evolving with the development of our ESG strategy as well. But really, how do we set out to uplift the well-being of Albertans by helping to solve societal challenges. Well, how do we do that? If you ask 100 people, what are the most pressing societal challenges, you'll get 100 different answers. And we really wanted to step away from the emotion of it in terms of, this person has this pet cause and this is what we're going to rally around and solve, or we've heard a lot of this and this is what we're going to help solve. So it's helping us make those database decisions in where we can help lend our support. And then, so it's helped define those areas. What are the most pressing societal challenges that we're seeing? Where are they showing up? And then over the long term, the idea is also that it will help us really see, are we moving the needle in the province?
Yeah, it's a really incredible example of a business responding to kind of its broader role in society. So let's talk about Alberta. Where does Alberta stand comparatively? Where are we strong? So same question that Scott asked about Canada, apply that to Alberta. Where are we strong? Where are we weak? And why?
Yeah, it's a bit hard to compare. And I would say it's strictly unfair. It would be unfair really to compare Alberta to the Canadian SPI. And the main reason for that is that the Alberta SPI, because of its focus within the province, uses different data sets from the Canadian SPI, because that has a much more global scope, right? And so it wouldn't be an apples to apples comparison to say that, yes, the Alberta SPI currently is sitting at 49 and Canada is in the 90s. But I would argue that it's not a fair comparison because they are based on very different indicators, right? And so in a sense, Alberta is competing against itself, if you will, until we have the next refresh of the Alberta SBI. But to your question about where we're doing really well and where there are opportunities, overall, Alberta does quite well when it comes to access to shelter. This is overall access to personal safety and inclusiveness. So actually, whereas, for Canada, inclusiveness was actually one of the lowest scores, for Alberta, we actually perform quite well when it comes to inclusiveness. So that's worth celebrating as well. And then also personal safety is an area where across the province, Alberta performs quite well. Now, when we think about where there might be opportunities for improvement, so things like access to advanced education, similar to the Canadian SBI, and also access to ICT, especially for rural areas, as one could imagine. And then where there's another opportunity for improvement is health and wellness, especially mental health, improving access to mental health. And I know Holly will touch on this a bit later, but those are areas where we see opportunities for improvement when we look at the Alberta SBI.
Mm-hmm. Well, the health and wellness thing is really interesting because that came up as quite a large theme in our Define the Decade project. And when we've been out and have talked about this project with policymakers, business leaders, life sciences, health, wellness, that does come up quite a bit. And so I see there's a lot of opportunity, but a lot of interest in the province to really put some focus and investment into improving health outcomes in the province and then exporting that kind of beyond. So thinking about improving some of these outcomes on areas where there are opportunities for improvement, how do we do that? What are some of those needle movers, as we like to call them, to improve some of these things?
Yeah, I think these are some really complicated issues, and it's going to take a lot of collaboration and innovation to help move the needle. It's not going to be solved by one organization or one sector. It's going to take everyone to move it forward, right? One of the first steps has been raising awareness that the Alberta Index exists in the province and that people can use it to see what the issues are in their own communities. And trying to get
we'll link that in the show notes too, so people that haven't had a chance to look at it can find it as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the first steps has been getting it in front of municipalities and not-for-profits and businesses and organizations like Business Council of Alberta, so that, and maybe at some point in the future, ideally, we would all contribute data to the index and help make it even better. One early example of how ATB has moved that data into action is how we partner in the community. For instance, we partnered with a company called Mage Networks, who's working to bring reliable internet to rural communities, and we help them bring their service to the town of Foremost. In terms of access to education, we know that was an issue, so we dug a little bit further. Why is it an issue? What are we seeing? And we've seen that Alberta has low graduation rates. How do we improve that? We talked with a lot of organizations, including United Way, University of Alberta, and a number of others. Why is that, and where is it that we need more support? And so in terms of community investment on that side, we've supported a number of organizations supporting mentorship and STEM education and early literacy that will have that effect later on to support those high school graduation rates.
Mm-hmm. And we talked about how it's unfair to compare Alberta to global jurisdictions. Are there plans to scale this across Canada to other provinces and territories to actually kind of make a fair comparison of how Alberta is doing?
Yes, absolutely. And Holly mentioned that we're happy at ATB and as Albertans to have been the innovators in this space, and we hope that it will inspire other jurisdictions to emulate and to create SBI. So right now, from what we know from our partners at the Social Progress Imperative, there are a number of other provinces that are in discussions and exploring opportunities to create comparable social progress indices. So stay tuned. Once we have more information, hopefully we will be able to make that fair comparison to see how we fare against much more rigorous way other provinces and territories.
Look at you both being leaders.
No, I look forward to being able to compare across provinces, but just in what you shared with us already, I think it's interesting to look both at the strengths and weaknesses that each place has. Some of those positives that you shared. Yeah, I'm very proud of Alberta being an inclusive place and a safe place. And the fact that we perform highly on those is very interesting. And then there's policy implications, obviously, that come from the areas where we're a little bit more weak. And maybe that's where we'll take the conversation next. So data is good, but it's most valuable when we can use it to actually create good in the world, right, versus just looking straight at the data. So when you think about this work, what are the policy implications here? How can we use this to drive good things in our society, investment, talent attraction, or even just to create more inclusion and belonging?
I can speak maybe a bit briefly, give two examples of companies that have actually incorporated the SBI into their investment pitch decks, essentially. So Meg Energy, and I'm sure both of you are familiar with Meg Energy.
Meg and their CEO, Derek, are prominent members of ours. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, there you go. Yes. So, wonderful. If you were to go on to Meg Energy's website, you would see that they have this investor presentation. And I think the latest one was from May that I came across. And in that slide deck, they actually incorporate the SBI. So this is the country level one, so the Canada one, the global one, as one of 3 ESG metrics that they look at. And this is looking at how do they position and compare Canada against other jurisdictions, whether that's the US, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, other oil producing jurisdictions, right? And so just to, I guess, underscore the opportunities, especially as more businesses are now talking about being purpose-driven and being purpose-led and demonstrating that they are committed. A lot of businesses want to demonstrate that they're committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. And fortunately, the SBI aligns quite closely with the SDGs. Mm-hmm. So what some businesses are doing is using it as a proxy to track their performance and what they're doing to advance the SDGs. The other example I just like to share is a Brazilian natural gas company called Eneva, ENEVA actually, and they've also incorporated the SBI as one of their ESG metrics. So there was some opportunities, and I would say that there's an alignment. Since there's so many different ESG frameworks and metrics, the SBI lends itself quite easily as a complement to whatever metrics different stakeholders might be interested in. So that's from the business side in terms of how businesses are positioning and leveraging the SBI as part of their investment pitch, essentially to investors or to other stakeholders.
Sure. It puts data behind some of what we've been saying for some time, which is that Canada performs well on a lot of these metrics from a global perspective, and certainly relative to our comparators.
So on the global side, those are some really good examples. And then within Alberta, there's also really some cool partnership opportunities ahead of us in terms of coming around those specific challenges, whether it's supporting not-for-profits or lending their core business expertise to help solve those problems and help champion the solutions.
Great examples from both around the world and close to home. Holly, I love that specific example you shared earlier of bringing broadband to foremost Alberta, population 540, I think. Those are the kind of places that we need to be thinking about if we want to create opportunities for everybody in our society. Now, I'd like to bring up a topic around ESG. ESG really critically important for lots of the businesses that we both work with all the time, but also there's a huge variety of measures and matrices that we could be using. Sometimes we talk about being concerned about sort of a wall of compliance that's coming at many companies in terms of reporting against all of these. Help us understand how you think about social progress index, the social progress imperative relative to ESG. How do those two concepts fit together?
Yeah, we're actually a little bit of a journey ourselves, and Afiba can touch on this as well in terms of evolving our own sustainability reporting along with our ESG strategy and how everything fits in. I'd say the index provides that macro level. How are we doing as a community? Are we moving the needle long term? What's that higher level achievement in terms of social progress? And then when we're looking at our own reporting, how are we contributing? What are the other indicators that we can use? Afiba, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I guess I would go back to those two examples I shared about, those two different energy companies based in very different jurisdictions, right? How they've incorporated the SBI into their ESG reporting. So I think that's where I see an opportunity. The SBI is a bit agnostic in a sense that to your point, Scott, about, there's so many different ESG frameworks and approaches, right? But the SPI it can easily be incorporated. If one were looking at the GRI framework or TCFD, whatever, SASB, whatever ESG framework an organization would land on, SPI could easily kind of blend in seamlessly. And that's intentional, but somewhat, I guess, intentional in that when they were designing, they being the social progress imperative, when they were creating the SPI, they worked quite closely with partners from different UN member states to align it. I mentioned it's closely aligned with the SDGs, right? The SDGs, and a lot of companies, the Sustainable Development Goals. Right. And given the interest in helping to, move the needle and progress on these SDGs, just to ensure that it could be a proxy for social progress. So now I would say that when we think about ESG and how do you kind of assess that social dimension or the environmental dimension, the SPI could easily be, I guess, adapted as one of many metrics that could go into a business or organization's ESG reporting.
And how about, advice that you might give to specific businesses? Yeah, ATB banks a lot of businesses in the province of Alberta, from large to medium to even very small. When a business is looking at this, what would be your advice to them? How can they think about the social progress index? How can they move the needle on some of these things?
I think going back to what we said before in terms of local businesses, how can you lend your own expertise? What are your resources and the influence that you have within your own community? Anyone can use the index. It is available publicly. So I'd encourage you to look at what those issues are locally. And then whether it's supporting non-for-profits that are doing work in this area and creating innovative solutions, or maybe you have some passionate team members who are eager to work on a project or want to lend your expertise helping to create some of these solutions. I think there's a ton of opportunities ahead of us.
Well, and let's talk about the government and policy side of this for a moment as well. I think we're a policy organization, so we like to think a lot about decision makers and policy as well. Do you think that we should be using tools like the Social Progress Index to maybe measure our governments and policies differently? What makes headlines all the time is economic growth and unemployment numbers, which are very important, but rarely do we see sort of metric put to some of these other things in society. Do you think that we should be looking at a broader basket from our policymakers too?
Yeah, I think we would say that there's certainly a role for policymakers, and it is one that there are other examples from different UK jurisdictions. So specifically in London, there are different boroughs in London that have leveraged the SPI in various ways, or in California, different counties have leveraged it to suit their purposes. So it is something that policymakers could leverage. I think where we think about it sometimes in our conversation when we do the road shows is it could complement. The SPI is not intended to replace conventional economic metrics, right? So it's intended to complement GDP or household median income or whatever other economic metrics policymakers might be interested in. But yes, we would say that there is a role that, depending on the needs of the policymakers, that this could be one way to assess progress and use it to inform investment decisions or how resources are allocated.
And to the extent, if you're aware of it, how have some of those examples, how have they incorporated? You mentioned the counties in the UK or the communities in California. Are they competing against each other? Or are they using it just to sort of keep their eye on a wider variety of things? Yeah. Could you pull that thread just a little further for us?
Yeah, I think from the examples that were shared at the What Works Summit hosted by ATB and the Social Progress Imperative last month. Yeah, just a little, to celebrate ourselves a little bit.
You always got to celebrate. Yeah, throw the little plug in there for sure.
Absolutely. But the one example from a London borough called Barking and Dagenham. So they actually had one of their councillors of the borough, who's a politician, at the presentation. And she shared how her borough has leveraged the SPI. So they actually incorporated it into their modeling when they were trying to anticipate the number of community members who would be in their borough specifically, who would be impacted by COVID pandemic, who are at high risk. So they could make sure they were more proactive and take a much more proactive approach to ensure those people had support. So I think in terms of how some policymakers are using it, it's not necessarily in a competitive sense. It's more, based on the most pressing needs in our community, where do we need to pay the most attention? what needs to be addressed based on what the data in our community is telling us. Right. So it's not intended to pit communities against each other. Like I live in Edmonton Southwest. Now, if you were to look at the areas of opportunities in my neighborhood or my kind of AHS subzone, it would vary from maybe Edmonton North or another community or Calgary Southwest. And the intention is not a race. It's just, okay, in my community, based on the demographics and the needs, where are the opportunities? And how can we ensure that we're collaborating as policymakers, as businesses, organizations, and nonprofits to uplift the well-being of Albertans, which is a shared goal for all of us, right?
Absolutely, it is. I like how you've described that. That's much more productive in terms of being proactive than the concept of sort of competing. I just can't help myself. Anytime you give me a score in something, I think about how I can get the score higher than somebody else's score. But that's a natural human.
I can attest. Scott is the worst person to play any game against.
I'm really not.
You always
I'm not all
lose.
that much fun. Wow, I'm not.
Well, you can
Unless
celebrate
you
us having a higher score than the US. That is, we're celebrated for sure. So
always it is. Well, this has been a fabulous conversation. I've learned a lot and we're reaching the end of it. So I think I just ask, we always ask our guests to sort of wrap it up into a final thought. The people who are listening to this podcast are policymakers, executives in business, and average everyday Albertans as well. What's a final thought you'd love to leave them with?
I'm actually inspired by the Define the Decade plan. I think there's a really natural fit there in creating a future where everyone in the province is thriving. That benefits all of us. In CSR particular and ESG, we see, people are looking to businesses to help solve societal challenges, and it's possible if we work together.
What a great thought. Thank you so much. And appreciate the plug for Define the Decade as well. I think these two pieces of work are incredibly thematically aligned, and look forward to working with you more to try and make lives better for Albertans.
Absolutely. I would just, if I could briefly just echo Holly's point and just commend you on Define the Decade. When I was going through it, beautiful presentation, but I actually saw myself in it, and then sometimes you don't see yourself, well, at least for me, as a visible minority. And I felt really moved by the presentation, some of the issues discussed, and I was very proud as well. So kudos to you for a wonderful job. And the last thought I would share is that, if we're really interested and we intend to improve the well-being of all Albertans, we have to align on the metrics so that we can assess progress and where we need to pivot or redirect. So you can improve what you don't measure, right? So the SBI is meant to be a shared metric for all stakeholders, including businesses and communities and nonprofits and individuals and policymakers.
Totally agree. Shared metrics and shared data is, the underpinning to any sort of good collective action policy. Thank you both very much.
Thanks so much, Scott. Thanks, Brittany.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And again, if you liked this episode and want to support our message of shared prosperity for all, head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts to subscribe, rate the show, and give us a quick review. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.